we're sharing together. So thank you. I'd invite you all to think about a time when somebody showed up for you. Maybe they brought you soup when you were sick, or maybe they called you when you were lonely or grieving. Perhaps they traveled very far to visit you in person and to give you that hug that you needed. Of course, we know the pain of what happens when we feel like someone hasn't shown up for us. Somebody was supposed to be there, but wasn't. And this time of year is a joyous one, but can be difficult as we think about those who aren't here. The moments left empty or the expectations unmet. But in the midst of that, we cling to a truth that God did and God does show up in a stable, in a child, in a love that came to be with us. Whatever this time of year might bring for each of us, we trust that God's presence is again and again offered to us in the places often that we least expect. Because when God shows up in a stable, God transforms the ordinary into something holy. When God shows up in the cry of a newborn, God brings hope where there was once silence. When God shows up among the humble, God reveals the greatness of love amid the smoke and mirrors of human power. When God shows up in the darkness of night, we are given a light that cannot be extinguished. On this Christmas Eve, we gather to reflect that light of Christ, the birth of Christ, and we find ourselves standing on the edge of a mystery, one that begins in the dark but unfolds in the most peculiar of ways. God, who is infinite and unfathomable, beyond comprehension, chose to enter time and space in a peculiar way. In the story we've heard from the Gospel of Luke, the first to receive this announcement of the birth of the Christ child, it wasn't the kings or the priests, nor the wealthy merchants or the nobility, but simple, ordinary shepherds. Shepherds who were living in the fields far from the honors or comforts of city life. They were deemed the unimportant ones, those who had no claim to fame or glory. And yet it was them that the angel offered this announcement. Don't be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. God shows up not to the powerful or the righteous, but to the humble, to the overlooked, to the ones we least expect. God shows up in our brokenness amid violence and empire and genocide, seeking no nod of approval from the powerful. God shows up in a story of both joy and sorrow, teaching us that love is born through both. And when God shows up and the angels declare, God shows up to give this news to all the people. This moment of divine revelation invites us to reflect about our own lives. You see, we live in a world that often demands more and more from us. Buy more, be more, do more. But God's choice to arrive to us in the form of a helpless baby tells us that we do not need to buy or to be or to do anything to be transformed by God. It is often in the midst of our brokenness and pain, in our humility, that we're in a place to pay attention to the truth that is around us, that God just keeps showing up. God doesn't wait for us to get everything just in place. God doesn't need grand preparations or ideal circumstances. God doesn't look for the most beautiful place to take up residence. God just shows up in our everyday lives, in our quiet moments, in our tears and our failures, and in our yearnings. Just as the shepherds received the message of Christ's birth and they hurried to see him, we too are invited to encounter the all-loving God in the midst of our day-to-day lives. So on this holy night, let's ask ourselves, where is God showing up for you? And if nothing comes to mind for you when I ask that question, I want to share the ending of a story that I often read to my children. It says, but whenever you aren't sure what God is like, think about what makes you feel safe, what makes you feel brave, and what makes you feel loved, because that's what God is like. And that's how God shows up, and God never stops showing up for you. Those little candles that Peg and Dwight lit for us at the beginning of this service, those little candles that we will light soon as we sing Silent Night, these are small but persistent flames, symbolizing God's promises to us that even the smallest light can chase away the darkest shadows of our world, because in those darkest of hours and places, God certainly shows up. God shows up, writes author Rachel Held Evans, in a cattle trough, on a throne, among the poor, with the sick, on a donkey, in a fishing boat, with the addict, with the hypocrite, with the forgotten, in places of power and in places of oppression, in poverty and in wealth, where God's name is known and where God's name is not known, with our friends and with our enemies, in our convictions, in our doubts, in our life, in our death, at the table and at the cross. And right here, God just keeps showing up. In that night where the shepherds heard the good news, God was there and God is here. God was in the swaddling clothes and on that cross and on that grave and on that throne. For no amount of darkness can overcome the light or keep the God who loves you from showing up. Amen.